Chapter 12. Theobald's engagement was all very well as far as it went, but there was an old gentleman with a bald head and rosy cheeks in a counting house in Paternoster Row who must sooner or later be told of what his son had in view, and Theobald's heart fluttered when he asked himself what view this old gentleman was likely to take of the situation. The murder, however, had to come out, and Theobald and his intended, perhaps imprudently, resolved on making a clean breast of it at once. He wrote what he and Christina, who helped him to draft the letter, thought to be everything that was filial, and expressed himself as anxious to be married with the least possible delay. He could not help saying this, as Christina was at his shoulder, and he knew it was safe, for his father might be trusted not to help him. He wound up by asking his father to use any influence that might be at his command to help him to get a living, inasmuch as it might be years before a college living fell vacant, and he saw no other chance of being able to marry, for neither he nor his intended had any money except Theobald's fellowship, which would, of course, lapse on his taking a wife. Any step of Theobald's was sure to be objectionable in his father's eyes, but that at 23 he should want to marry a penniless girl who was 4 years older than himself, afforded a golden opportunity which the old gentleman, for so I may now call him, as he was at least 60, embraced with characteristic eagerness. "The ineffable folly," he wrote, on receiving his son's letter, "of your fancied passion for Miss Willoughby fills me with the gravest apprehensions. Making every allowance for a lover's blindness, I still have no doubt that the lady herself is a well-conducted and amiable young person, who would not disgrace our family, but were she 10 times more desirable as a daughter-in-law than I can allow myself to hope, your joint poverty is an insuperable objection to your marriage. I have 4 other children besides yourself, and my expenses do not permit me to save money. This year they have been especially heavy. Indeed, I have had to purchase 2 not inconsiderable pieces of land which happened to come into the market and were necessary to complete a property which I have long wanted to round off in this way. I gave you an education regardless of expense, which has put you in possession of a comfortable income, at an age when many young men are dependent. I have thus started you fairly in life, and may claim that you should cease to be a drag upon me further. Long engagements are proverbially unsatisfactory, and in the present case the prospect seems interminable. What interest, pray, do you suppose I have that I could get a living for you? Can I go up and down the country begging people to provide for my son because he has taken it into his head to want to get married without sufficient means? I do not wish to write unkindly, nothing can be farther from my real feelings towards you. But there is often more kindness in plain speaking than in any amount of soft words which can end in no substantial performance. Of course, I bear in mind that you are of age, and can therefore please yourself, but if you choose to claim the strict letter of the law, and act without consideration for your father's feelings, you must not be surprised if you one day find that I have claimed a like liberty for myself. Believe me, your affectionate father, G. Pontifex. I found this letter along with those already given and a few more which I need not give, but throughout which the same tone prevails, and in all of which there is the more or less obvious shake of the will near the end of the letter. Remembering Theobald's general dumbness concerning his father for the many years I knew him after his father's death, there was an eloquence in the preservation of the letters and in their endorsement letters from my father, which seemed to have with it some faint odor of health and nature. Theobald did not show his father's letter to Christina, nor, indeed, I believe to anyone. He was by nature secretive, and had been repressed too much and too early to be capable of railing or blowing off steam where his father was concerned. His sense of wrong was still inarticulate, felt as a dull dead weight ever present day by day, and if he woke at night time still continually present, but he hardly knew what it was. I was about the closest friend he had, and I saw but little of him, for I could not get on with him for long together. He said I had no reverence, whereas I thought that I had plenty of reverence for what deserved to be revered, but that the gods which he deemed golden were in reality made of baser metal. He never, as I have said, complained of his father to me, and his only other friends were, like himself, staid and prim, of evangelical tendencies, and deeply imbued with a sense of the sinfulness of any act of insubordination to parents, good young men, in fact, and one cannot blow off steam to a good young man. When Christina was informed by her lover of his father's opposition, and of the time which must probably elapse before they could be married, she offered, with how much sincerity I know not, to set him free from his engagement, but Theobald declined to be released, not at least, as he said, at present. Christina and Mrs. Ellaby knew they could manage him, and on this not very satisfactory footing the engagement was continued. His engagement and his refusal to be released at once raised Theobald in his own good opinion. Dull as he was, he had no small share of quiet self-approbation. He admired himself for his university distinction, for the purity of his life. I said of him once that if he had only a better temper he would be as innocent as a new-laid egg, and for his unimpeachable integrity in money matters. He did not despair of advancement in the church when he had once got a living, and of course it was within the bounds of possibility that he might one day become a bishop, and Christina said she felt convinced that this would ultimately be the case. As was natural for the daughter and intended wife of a clergyman, Christina's thoughts ran much upon religion, and she was resolved that even though an exalted position in this world were denied to her and Theobald, their virtues should be fully appreciated in the next. Her religious opinions coincided absolutely with Theobald's own, and many a conversation did she have with him about the glory of God, and the completeness with which they would devote themselves to it, as soon as Theobald had got his living and they were married. So certain was she of the great results which would then ensue that she wondered at times at the blindness shown by Providence towards its own truest interests in not killing off the rectors who stood between Theobald and his living a little faster. In those days people believed with a simple downrightness which I do not observe among educated men and women now. It had never so much as crossed Theobald's mind to doubt the literal accuracy of any syllable in the Bible. He had never seen any book in which this was disputed, nor met with anyone who doubted it. True, there was just a little scare about geology, but there was nothing in it. If it was said that God made the world in 6 days, why he did make it in 6 days, neither in more nor less. If it was said that he put Adam to sleep, took out one of his ribs and made a woman of it, why it was so as a matter of course. He, Adam, went to sleep as it might be himself, Theobald Pontifex, in a garden, as it might be the garden at Gramsford Rectory during the summer months when it was so pretty, only that it was larger, and had some tame wild animals in it. Then God came up to him, as it might be Mr. Ellaby or his father, dexterously took out one of his ribs without waking him, and miraculously healed the wound so that no trace of the operation remained. Finally, God had taken the rib perhaps into the greenhouse, and had turned it into just such another young woman as Christina. That was how it was done. There was neither difficulty nor shadow of difficulty about the matter. Could not God do anything he liked, and had he not in his own inspired book told us that he had done this? This was the average attitude of fairly educated young men and women towards the Mosaic cosmogony 50, 40, or even 20 years ago. The combating of infidelity, therefore, offered little scope for enterprising young clergymen, nor had the Church awakened to the activity which she has since displayed among the poor in our large towns. These were then left almost without an effort at resistance or cooperation to the labors of those who had succeeded Wesley. Missionary work indeed in heathen countries was being carried on with some energy, but Theobald did not feel any call to be a missionary. Christina suggested this to him more than once, and assured him of the unspeakable happiness it would be to her to be the wife of a missionary, and to share his dangers. She and Theobald might even be martyred. Of course they would be martyred simultaneously, and martyrdom many years hence as regarded from the arbor in the rectory garden was not painful. It would ensure them a glorious future in the next world, and at any rate posthumous renown in this, even if they were not miraculously restored to life again, and such things had happened ere now in the case of martyrs. Theobald, however, had not been kindled by Christina's enthusiasm, so she fell back upon the Church of Rome, an enemy more dangerous, if possible, than paganism itself. A combat with Romanism might even yet win for her and Theobald the crown of martyrdom. True, the Church of Rome was tolerably quiet just then, but it was the calm before the storm. Of this she was assured, with a conviction deeper than she could have attained by any argument founded upon mere reason. "We, dearest Theobald," she exclaimed, "will be ever faithful. We will stand firm and support one another even in the hour of death itself. God in His mercy may spare us from being burnt alive. He may or may not do so. O Lord," and she turned her eyes prayerfully to heaven, "spare my Theobald, or grant that he may be beheaded." "My dearest," said Theobald gravely, "do not let us agitate ourselves unduly. If the hour of trial comes, we shall be best prepared to meet it by having led a quiet, unobtrusive life of self-denial and devotion to God's glory. Such a life let us pray God that it may please Him to enable us to pray that we may lead." "Dearest Theobald," exclaimed Christina, drying the tears that had gathered in her eyes, "you are always, always right. Let us be self-denying, pure, upright, truthful in word and deed." She clasped her hands and looked up to heaven as she spoke. "Dearest," rejoined her lover, "we have ever hitherto endeavored to be all of these things. We have not been worldly people. Let us watch and pray that we may so continue to the end." The moon had risen and the arbor was getting damp, so they adjourned further aspirations for a more convenient season. At other times Christina pictured herself and Theobald as braving the scorn of almost every human being in the achievement of some mighty task which should redound to the honor of her Redeemer. She could face anything for this. But always towards the end of her vision there came a little coronation scene high up in the golden regions of the heavens, and a diadem was set upon her head by the Son of Man himself, amid a host of angels and archangels who looked on with envy and admiration. And here even Theobald himself was out of it. If there could be such a thing as the mammon of righteousness, Christina would have assuredly made friends with it. Her papa and mamma were very estimable people and would in the course of time receive heavenly mansions in which they would be exceedingly comfortable, so doubtless would her sisters, so perhaps, even might her brothers, but for herself she felt that a higher destiny was preparing, which it was her duty never to lose sight of. The first step towards it would be her marriage with Theobald. In spite, however, of these flights of religious romanticism, Christina was a good-tempered, kindly-natured girl enough, who, if she had married a sensible layman, we will say a hotel keeper, would have developed into a good landlady and been deservedly popular with her guests. Such was Theobald's engaged life. Many a little present passed between the pair, and many a small surprise did they prepare pleasantly for one another. They never quarreled, and neither of them ever flirted with anyone else. Mrs. Ellaby and his future sisters-in-law idolized Theobald in spite of its being impossible to get another deacon to come and be played for as long as Theobald was able to help Mr. Ellaby, which now of course he did free gratis and for nothing. Two of the sisters, however, did manage to find husbands before Christina was actually married, and on each occasion Theobald played the part of decoy elephant. In the end only 2 out of the 7 daughters remained single. After 3 or 4 years, old Mr. Pontifex became accustomed to his son's engagement and looked upon it as among the things which had now a prescriptive right to toleration. In the spring of 1831, more than 5 years after Theobald had first walked over to Crampsford, one of the best livings in the gift of the college unexpectedly fell vacant, and was for various reasons declined by the 2 fellows senior to Theobald, who might each have been expected to take it. The living was then offered to and of course accepted by Theobald, being in value not less than £500 a year with a suitable house and garden. Old Mr. Pontifex then came down more handsomely than was expected and settled £10,000 on his son and daughter-in-law for life with remainder to such of their issue as they might appoint. In the month of July, 1831 Theobald and Christina became man and wife. Chapter 13. A due number of old shoes had been thrown at the carriage in which the happy pair departed from the rectory, and it had turned the corner at the bottom of the village. It could then be seen for 200 or 300 yards creeping past a fir coppice, and after this was lost to view. "John," said Mr. Willoughby to his manservant, "shut the gate," and he went indoors with a sigh of relief which seemed to say, "I have done it, and I am alive." This was the reaction after a burst of enthusiastic merriment during which the old gentleman had run 20 yards after the carriage to fling a slipper at it, which he had duly flung. But what were the feelings of Theobald and Christina when the village was past and they were rolling quietly by the fir plantation? It is at this point that even the stoutest heart must fail, unless it beat in the breast of one who is over head and ears in love. If a young man is in a small boat on a choppy sea, along with his affianced bride, and both are seasick, and if the sick swain can forget his own anguish in the happiness of holding the fair one's head when she is at her worst, then he is in love, and his heart will be in no danger of failing him as he passes his fir plantation. Other people, and unfortunately by far the greater number of those who get married must be classed among the other people, will inevitably go through a quarter or half an hour of greater or less badness as the case may be. Taking numbers into account, I should think more mental suffering had been undergone in the streets leading from St. George's, Hanover Square, than in the condemned cells of Newgate. There is no time at which what the Italians call la figlia della morte lays her cold hand upon a man more awfully than during the first half hour that he is alone with a woman whom he has married but never genuinely loved. Death's daughter did not spare Theobald. He had behaved very well hitherto. When Christina had offered to let him go, he had stuck to his post with a magnanimity on which he had plumed himself ever since. From that time forward he had said to himself, "I, at any rate, am the very soul of honor, I am not, etc., etc." True, at the moment of magnanimity the actual cash payment, so to speak, was still distant. When his father gave formal consent to his marriage things began to look more serious. When the college living had fallen vacant and been accepted they looked more serious still, but when Christina actually named the day, then Theobald's heart fainted within him. The engagement had gone on so long that he had got into a groove, and the prospect of change was disconcerting. Christina and he had got on, he thought to himself, very nicely for a great number of years. Why should they not continue to go on as they were doing now for the rest of their lives? But there was no more chance of escape for him than for the sheep which is being driven to the butcher's back premises, and like the sheep he felt that there was nothing to be gained by resistance, so he made none. He behaved, in fact, with decency, and was declared on all hands to be one of the happiest men imaginable. Now, however, to change the metaphor, the drop had actually fallen, and the poor wretch was hanging in mid-air along with the creature of his affections. This creature was now 33 years old, and looked at, she had been weeping, and her eyes and nose were reddish. "If I have done it and I am alive," was written on Mr. Willoughby's face after he had thrown the shoe. "I have done it, and I do not see how I can possibly live much longer," was upon the face of Theobald as he was being driven along by the fir plantation. This, however, was not apparent at the rectory. All that could be seen there was the bobbing up and down of the postillion's head, which just overtopped the hedge by the roadside as he rose in his stirrups, and the black and yellow body of the carriage. For some time the pair said nothing. What they must have felt during their first half hour, the reader must guess, for it is beyond my power to tell him. At the end of that time, however, Theobald had rummaged up a conclusion from some odd corner of his soul to the effect that now he and Christina were married the sooner they fell into their future mutual relations the better. If people who are in a difficulty will only do the first little reasonable thing which they can clearly recognize as reasonable, they will always find the next step more easy both to see and take. What, then, thought Theobald, was here at this moment the first and most obvious matter to be considered, and what would be an equitable view of his and Christina's relative positions in respect to it? Clearly their first dinner was their first joint entry into the duties and pleasures of married life. No less clearly it was Christina's duty to order it, and his own to eat it and pay for it. The arguments leading to this conclusion, and the conclusion itself, flashed upon Theobald about 3.5 miles after he had left Crampsford on the road to Newmarket. He had breakfasted early, but his usual appetite had failed him. They had left the vicarage at noon without staying for the wedding breakfast. Theobald liked an early dinner. It dawned upon him that he was beginning to be hungry. From this to the conclusions stated in the preceding paragraph, the steps had been easy. After a few minutes' further reflection, he broached the matter to his bride, and thus the ice was broken. Mrs. Theobald was not prepared for so sudden an assumption of importance. Her nerves, never of the strongest, had been strung to their highest tension by the event of the morning. She wanted to escape observation. She was conscious of looking a little older than she quite liked to look as a bride who had been married that morning. She feared the landlady, the chambermaid, the waiter, everybody and everything. Her heart beat so fast that she could hardly speak, much less go through the ordeal of ordering dinner in a strange hotel with a strange landlady. She begged and prayed to be let off. If Theobald would only order dinner this once, she would order any day and every day in future. But the inexorable Theobald was not to be put off with such absurd excuses. He was master now. Had not Christina less than 2 hours ago promised solemnly to honor and obey him, and was she turning restive over such a trifle as this? The loving smile departed from his face, and was succeeded by a scowl which that old Turk, his father, might have envied. "Stuff and nonsense, my dearest Christina," he exclaimed mildly, and stamped his foot upon the floor of the carriage. "It is a wife's duty to order her husband's dinner. You are my wife, and I shall expect you to order mine." For Theobald was nothing if he was not logical. The bride began to cry, and said he was unkind, whereon he said nothing, but revolved unutterable things in his heart. Was this, then, the end of his 6 years of unflagging devotion? Was it for this that when Christina had offered to let him off, he had stuck to his engagement? Was this the outcome of her talks about duty and spiritual mindedness, that now upon the very day of her marriage she should fail to see that the first step in obedience to God lay in obedience to himself? He would drive back to Cransford, he would complain to Mr. and Mrs. Libby. He didn't mean to have married Christina, he hadn't married her, it was all a hideous dream. He would, but a voice kept ringing in his ears which said, "You can't. Can't I?" screamed the unhappy creature to himself. "No," said the remorseless voice, "you can't. You're a married man." He rolled back in his corner of the carriage and for the first time felt how iniquitous were the marriage laws of England. But he would buy Milton's prose works and read his pamphlet on divorce. He might perhaps be able to get them at Newmarket. So the bride sat crying in one corner of the carriage, and the bridegroom sulked in the other, and he feared her as only a bridegroom can fear. Presently, however, a feeble voice was heard from the bride's corner saying, dearest Theobald, forgive me, I have been very, very wrong. Please do not be angry with me. I will order thee." But the word dinner was checked by rising sobs. When Theobald heard these words a load began to be lifted from his heart, but he only looked towards her, and that not too pleasantly. "Please tell me," continued the voice, "what you think you would like, and I will tell the landlady when we get to Newmer." But another burst of sobs checked the completion of the word. The load on Theobald's heart grew lighter and lighter. Was it possible that she might not be going to henpeck him after all? Besides, had she not diverted his attention from herself to his approaching dinner? He swallowed down more of his apprehensions and said, but still gloomily, "I think we might have a roast fowl with bread sauce, new potatoes and green peas, and then we will see if they could let us have a cherry tart and some cream." After a few minutes more he drew her towards him, kissed away her tears, and assured her that he knew she would be a good wife to him. "Dearest Theobald," she exclaimed in answer, "you are an angel." Theobald believed her, and in 10 minutes more the happy couple alighted at the inn at Newmarket. Bravely did Christina go through her arduous task. Eagerly did she beseech the landlady, in secret, not to keep her Theobald waiting longer than was absolutely necessary. "If you have any soup ready, you know, Mrs. Barber, it might save 10 minutes, for we might have it while the fowl was browning." See how necessity had nerved her. But in truth she had a splitting headache, and would have given anything to have been alone. The dinner was a success. A pint of sherry had warmed Theobald's heart, and he began to hope that, after all, matters might still go well with him. He had conquered in the first battle, and this gives great prestige. How easy it had been too. Why had he never treated his sisters in this way? He would do so next time he saw them. He might in time be able to stand up to his brother John, or even his father. Thus do we build castles in air when flushed with wine and conquest. The end of the honeymoon saw Mrs. Theobald the most devotedly obsequious wife in all England. According to the old saying, Theobald had killed the cat at the beginning. It had been a very little cat, a mere kitten in fact, or he might have been afraid to face it, but such as it had been he had challenged it to mortal combat, and had held up its dripping head defiantly before his wife's face. The rest had been easy. Strange that one whom I have described hitherto as so timid and easily put upon should prove such a Tartar all of a sudden on the day of his marriage. Perhaps I have passed over his years of courtship too rapidly. During these he had become a tutor of his college, and had at last been junior dean. I never yet knew a man whose sense of his own importance did not become adequately developed after he had held a resident fellowship for 5 or 6 years. True, immediately on arriving within a 10-mile radius of his father's house, an enchantment fell upon him, so that his knees waxed weak, his greatness departed, and he again felt himself like an overgrown baby under a perpetual cloud. But then he was not often at Elmhurst, and as soon as he left it the spell was taken off again. Once more he became the fellow and tutor of his college, the junior dean, the betrothed of Christina, the idol of the Illiby womankind. From all which it may be gathered that if Christina had been a Barbary hen, and had ruffled her feathers in any show of resistance, Theobald would not have ventured to swagger with her. But she was not a Barbary hen, she was only a common hen, and that too with rather a smaller share of personal bravery than hens generally have. Chapter 14. Battersby on the Hill was the name of the village of which Theobald was now rector. It contained 400 or 500 inhabitants, scattered over a rather large area, and consisting entirely of farmers and agricultural labourers. The rectory was commodious, and placed on the brow of a hill which gave it a delightful prospect. There was a fair sprinkling of neighbours within visiting range, but with 1 or 2 exceptions they were the clergymen and clergymen's families of the surrounding villages. By these the Pontifexes were welcomed as great acquisitions to the neighbourhood. Mr. Pontifex, they said, was so clever, he had been senior classic and senior wrangler, a perfect genius in fact, and yet with so much sound practical common sense as well. As son of such a distinguished man as the great Mr. Pontifex the publisher, he would come into a large property by and by. Was there not an elder brother? Yes, but there would be so much that Theobald would probably get something very considerable. Of course they would give dinner parties. And Mrs. Pontifex, what a charming woman she was certainly not exactly pretty perhaps, but then she had such a sweet smile and her manner was so bright and winning. She was so devoted to her husband and her husband to her, they really did come up to one's ideas of what lovers used to be in days of old. It was rare to meet with such a pair in these degenerate times, it was quite beautiful, etc., etc. Such were the comments of the neighbours on the new arrivals. As for Theobald's own parishioners, the farmers were civil and the labourers and their wives obsequious. There was a little dissent, the legacy of a careless predecessor, but as Mrs. Theobald said proudly, I think Theobald may be trusted to deal with that. The church was then an interesting specimen of late Norman, with some early English additions. It was what in these days would be called in a very bad state of repair, but 40 or 50 years ago few churches were in good repair. If there is one feature more characteristic of the present generation than another, it is that it has been a great restorer of churches. Horace preached church restoration in his ode Delicta Majorum Emeritus Louis, Romain, Donac Templa Reficeris et Esclabens Diarum et Vota Negro Simulacra Fumo. Nothing went right with Rome for long together after the Augustan age, but whether it was because she did restore the temples or because she did not restore them I know not. They certainly went all wrong after Constantine's time, and yet Rome is still a city of some importance. I may say here that before Theobald had been many years at Battersby he found scope for useful work in the rebuilding of Battersby Church, which he carried out at considerable cost, towards which he subscribed liberally himself. He was his own architect, and this saved expense, but architecture was not very well understood about the year 1834, when Theobald commenced operations, and the result is not as satisfactory as it would have been if he had waited a few years longer. Every man's work, whether it be literature or music or pictures or architecture or anything else, is always a portrait of himself, and the more he tries to conceal himself the more clearly will his character appear in spite of him. I may very likely be condemning myself, all the time that I am writing this book, for I know that whether I like it or no I am portraying myself more surely than I am portraying any of the characters whom I set before the reader. I am sorry that it is so, but I cannot help it, after which soft nemesis I will say that Battersby Church in its amended form has always struck me as a better portrait of Theobald than any sculptor or painter short of a great master would be able to produce. I remember staying with Theobald some 6 or 7 months after he was married, and while the old church was still standing. I went to church, and felt as Newman must have felt on certain occasions when he had to accompany his master on his return after having been cured of his leprosy. I have carried away a more vivid recollection of this and of the people, than of Theobald's sermon. Even now I can see the men in blue smock frocks reaching to their heels, and more than one old woman in a scarlet cloak, the row of stolid, dull, vacant ploughboys, ungainly in build, uncomely in face, lifeless, apathetic, a race a good deal more like the pre-revolution French peasant as described by Carlyle than is pleasant to reflect upon, a race now supplanted by a smarter, comelier and more hopeful generation, which has discovered that it too has a right to as much happiness as it can get, and with clearer ideas about the best means of getting it. They shamble in one after another, with steaming breath, for it is winter, and loud clattering of hobnailed boots. They beat the snow from off them as they enter, and through the open door I catch a momentary glimpse of a dreary leaden sky and snow-clad tombstones. Somehow or other I find the strain which Handel has wedded to the words "There the ploughman near at hand," has got into my head and there is no getting it out again. How marvelously old Handel understood these people. They bobbed to Theobald as they passed the reading desk. "The people hereabouts are truly respectful," whispered Christina to me, "they know their betters, and take their seats in a long row against the wall. The choir clamber up into the gallery with their instruments, a violoncello, a clarinet and a trombone. I see them and soon I hear them, for there is a hymn before the service, a wild strain, a remnant, if I mistake not, of some pre-Reformation litany. I have heard what I believe was its remote musical progenitor in the Church of SS. Giovanni e Paolo at Venice not 5 years since, and again I have heard it far away in mid-Atlantic upon a grey sea Sabbath in June, when neither winds nor waves are stirring, so that the emigrants gather on deck, and their plaintive psalm goes forth upon the silver haze of the sky, and on the wilderness of a sea that has sighed till it can sigh no longer. Or it may be heard at some Methodist camp meeting upon a Welsh hillside, but in the churches it is gone forever. If I were a musician I would take it as the subject for the adagio in a Wesleyan symphony. Gone now are the clarinet, the violoncello and the trombone, wild minstrelsy as of the doleful creatures in Ezekiel, discordant, but infinitely pathetic. Gone is that scare-babe stunter, that bellowing bull of Bashan the village blacksmith. Gone is the melodious carpenter, gone the brawny shepherd with the red hair, who roared more lustily than all, until they came to the words, "Shepherds with your flocks abiding," when modesty covered him with confusion, and compelled him to be silent, as though his own health were being drunk. They were doomed and had a presentiment of evil, even when first I saw them, but they had still a little lease of choir life remaining, and they roared out, "Wicked hands have pierced and nailed him to a tree." But no description can give a proper idea of the effect. When I was last in Battersby Church there was a harmonium played by a sweet-looking girl with a choir of school children around her, and they chanted the canticles to the most correct of chants, and they sang hymns ancient and modern. The high pews were gone, nay, the very gallery in which the old choir had sung was removed as an accursed thing which might remind the people of the high places, and Theobald was old, and Christina was lying under the yew trees in the churchyard. But in the evening later on I saw 3 very old men come chuckling out of a dissenting chapel, and surely enough they were my old friends the blacksmith, the carpenter and the shepherd. There was a look of content upon their faces which made me feel certain they had been singing, not doubtless with the old glory of the violoncello, the clarinet and the trombone, but still songs of Sion and no new-fangled papistry. Chapter 15. The hymn had engaged my attention. When it was over I had time to take stock of the congregation. They were chiefly farmers, fat, very well-to-do folk, who had come some of them with their wives and children from outlying farms 2 and 3 miles away, haters of popery and of anything which anyone might choose to say was popish, good, sensible fellows who detested theory of any kind, whose ideal was the maintenance of the status quo with perhaps a loving reminiscence of old war times, and a sense of wrong that the weather was not more completely under their control, who desired higher prices and cheaper wages, but otherwise were most contented when things were changing least, tolerators, if not lovers, of all that was familiar, haters of all that was unfamiliar. They would have been equally horrified at hearing the Christian religion doubted, and at seeing it practiced. "What can there be in common between Theobald and his parishioners?" said Christina to me, in the course of the evening, when her husband was for a few moments absent. "Of course one must not complain, but I assure you it grieves me to see a man of Theobald's ability thrown away upon such a place as this. If we had only been at Gaysbury, where there are the A's, the B's, the C's, and Lord D's place, as you know, quite close, I should not then have felt that we were living in such a desert, but I suppose it is for the best," she added more cheerfully, "and then of course the bishop will come to us whenever he is in the neighborhood, and if we were at Gaysbury he might have gone to Lord D's." Perhaps I have now said enough to indicate the kind of place in which Theobald's lines were cast, and the sort of woman he had married. As for his own habits, I see him trudging through muddy lanes and over long sweeps of plover-haunted pastures to visit a dying cottager's wife. He takes her meat and wine from his own table, and that not a little only but liberally. According to his lights also, he administers what he is pleased to call spiritual consolation. "I am afraid I'm going to hell, sir," says the sick woman with the wine. "Oh, sir, save me, don't let me go there. I couldn't stand it, sir, I should die with fear, the very thought of it drives me into a cold sweat all over." "Mrs. Thompson," says Theobald gravely, "you must have faith in the precious blood of your Redeemer, it is He alone who can save you." "But are you sure, sir," says she, looking wistfully at him, "that He will forgive me, for I've not been a very good woman, indeed I haven't, and if God would only say yes outright with his mouth when I ask whether my sins are forgiven me." "But they are forgiven you, Mrs. Thompson," says Theobald with some sternness, "for the same ground has been gone over a good many times already, and he has borne the unhappy woman's misgivings now for a full quarter of an hour." Then he puts a stop to the conversation by repeating prayers taken from the Visitation of the Sick, and overawes the poor wretch from expressing further anxiety as to her condition. "Can't you tell me, sir," she exclaims piteously, as she sees that he is preparing to go away, "can't you tell me that there is no day of judgment, and that there is no such place as hell? I can do without the heaven, sir, but I cannot do with the hell." Theobald is much shocked. "Mrs. Thompson," he rejoins impressively, "let me implore you to suffer no doubt concerning these 2 cornerstones of our religion to cross your mind at a moment like the present. If there is one thing more certain than another it is that we shall all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and that the wicked will be consumed in a lake of everlasting fire. Doubt this, Mrs. Thompson, and you are lost." The poor woman buries her fevered head in the coverlet in a paroxysm of fear which at last finds relief in tears. "Mrs. Thompson," says Theobald, with his hand on the door, "compose yourself, be calm. You must please to take my word for it that at the day of judgment your sins will be all washed white in the blood of the Lamb, Mrs. Thompson." "Yea," he exclaims frantically, "though they be as scarlet, yet shall they be as white as wool," and he makes off as fast as he can from the fetid atmosphere of the cottage to the pure air outside. Oh, how thankful he is when the interview is over! He returns home, conscious that he has done his duty, and administered the comforts of religion to a dying sinner. His admiring wife awaits him at the rectory, and assures him that never yet was clergyman so devoted to the welfare of his flock. He believes her. He has a natural tendency to believe everything that is told him, and who should know the facts of the case better than his wife? Poor fellow! He has done his best, but what does a fish's best come to when the fish is out of water? He has left meat and wine. That he can do. He will call again and will leave more meat and wine. Day after day he trudges over the same plover-haunted fields, and listens at the end of his walk to the same agony of forebodings, which day after day he silences, but does not remove, till at last a merciful weakness renders the sufferer careless of her future, and Theobald is satisfied that her mind is now peacefully at rest in Jesus. Chapter 16. He does not like this branch of his profession, indeed he hates it, but will not admit it to himself. The habit of not admitting things to himself has become a confirmed one with him. Nevertheless there haunts him an ill-defined sense that life would be pleasanter if there were no sick sinners, or if they would at any rate face an eternity of torture with more indifference. He does not feel that he is in his element. The farmers look as if they were in their element. They are full-bodied, healthy and contented, but between him and them there is a great gulf fixed. A hard and drawn look begins to settle about the corners of his mouth, so that even if he were not in a black coat and white tie a child might know him for a parson. He knows that he is doing his duty. Every day convinces him of this more firmly, but then there is not much duty for him to do. He is sadly in want of occupation. He has no taste for any of those field sports which were not considered unbecoming for a clergyman 40 years ago. He does not ride, nor shoot, nor fish, nor course, nor play cricket. Study, to do him justice, he had never really liked, and what inducement was there for him to study at Battersby? He reads neither old books nor new ones. He does not interest himself in art or science or politics, but he sets his back up with some promptness if any of them show any development unfamiliar to himself. True, he writes his own sermons, but even his wife considers that his forte lies rather in the example of his life, which is one long act of self-devotion, than in his utterances from the pulpit. After breakfast he retires to his study. He cuts little bits out of the Bible and gums them with exquisite neatness by the side of other little bits. This he calls making a harmony of the Old and New Testaments. Alongside the extracts he copies in the very perfection of handwriting extracts from Mede, the only man, according to Theobald, who really understood the book of Revelation, Patrick, and other old divines. He works steadily at this for half an hour every morning during many years, and the result is doubtless valuable. After some years have gone by he hears his children their lessons, and the daily oft-repeated screams that issue from the study during the lesson hours tell their own horrible story over the house. He has also taken to collecting a Hortus Siccus, and through the interest of his father was once mentioned in the Saturday magazine as having been the first to find a plant, whose name I have forgotten, in the neighborhood of Battersby. This number of the Saturday magazine has been bound in red morocco, and is kept upon the drawing-room table. He potters about his garden. If he hears a hen cackling he runs and tells Christina, and straightway goes hunting for the egg. When the two Miss Illibys came, as they sometimes did, to stay with Christina, they said the life led by their sister and brother-in-law was an idyll. Happy indeed was Christina in her choice, for that she had had a choice was a fiction which soon took root among them, and happy Theobald in his Christina. Somehow or other Christina was always a little shy of cards when her sisters were staying with her, though at other times she enjoyed a game of cribbage or a rubber of whist heartily enough, but her sisters knew they would never be asked to Battersby again if they were to refer to that little matter, and on the whole it was worth their while to be asked to Battersby. If Theobald's temper was rather irritable, he did not vent it upon them. By nature reserved, if he could have found someone to cook his dinner for him, he would rather have lived in a desert island than not. In his heart of hearts he held with Pope that the greatest nuisance to mankind is man, or words to that effect, only that women, with the exception perhaps of Christina, were worse. Yet for all this, when visitors called, he put a better face on it than anyone who was behind the scenes would have expected. He was quick too at introducing the names of any literary celebrities whom he had met at his father's house, and soon established an all-round reputation which satisfied even Christina herself. Whoso integer vitae scelerisque perus, it was asked, as Mr. Pontifex of Battersby. Whoso fit to be consulted if any difficulty about parish management should arise. Who such a happy mixture of the sincere uninquiring Christian and of the man of the world. For so people actually called him. They said he was such an admirable man of business. Certainly if he had said he would pay a sum of money at a certain time, the money would be forthcoming on the appointed day, and this is saying a good deal for any man. His constitutional timidity rendered him incapable of an attempt to overreach when there was the remotest chance of opposition or publicity, and his correct bearing and somewhat stern expression were a great protection to him against being overreached. He never talked of money, and invariably changed the subject whenever money was introduced. His expression of unutterable horror at all kinds of meanness was a sufficient guarantee that he was not mean himself. Besides, he had no business transactions save of the most ordinary butcher's book and baker's book description. His tastes, if he had any, were, as we have seen, simple. He had £900 a year and a house, the neighbourhood was cheap, and for some time he had no children to be a drag upon him. Who was not to be envied, and if envied, why then respected, if Theobald was not enviable. Yet I imagine that Christina was on the whole happier than her husband. She had not to go and visit sick parishioners, and the management of her house and the keeping of her accounts afforded as much occupation as she desired. Her principal duty was, as she well said, to her husband, to love him, honor him, and keep him in a good temper. To do her justice, she fulfilled this duty to the uttermost of her power. It would have been better perhaps if she had not so frequently assured her husband that he was the best and wisest of mankind, for no one in his little world ever dreamed of telling him anything else, and it was not long before he ceased to have any doubt upon the matter. As for his temper, which had become very violent at times, she took care to humor it on the slightest sign of an approaching outbreak. She had early found that this was much the easiest plan. The thunder was seldom for herself. Long before her marriage even she had studied his little ways, and knew how to add fuel to the fire as long as the fire seemed to want it, and then to damp it judiciously down, making as little smoke as possible. In money matters she was scrupulousness itself. Theobald made her a quarterly allowance for her dress, pocket money and little charities and presents. In these last items she was liberal in proportion to her income. Indeed, she dressed with great economy and gave away whatever was over in presents or charity. Oh, what a comfort it was to Theobald to reflect that he had a wife on whom he could rely never to cost him a sixpence of unauthorized expenditure. Letting alone her absolute submission, the perfect coincidence of her opinion with his own upon every subject and her constant assurances to him that he was right in everything which he took it into his head to say or do, what a tower of strength to him was her exactness in money matters. As years went by he became as fond of his wife as it was in his nature to be of any living thing, and applauded himself for having stuck to his engagement, a piece of virtue of which he was now reaping the reward. Even when Christina did outrun her quarterly stipend by some 30 shillings or a couple of pounds, it was always made perfectly clear to Theobald how the deficiency had arisen. There had been an unusually costly evening dress bought which was to last a long time, or somebody's unexpected wedding had necessitated a more handsome present than the quarter's balance would quite allow, the excessive expenditure was always repaid in the following quarter or quarters, even though it were only 10 shillings at a time. I believe, however, that after they had been married some 20 years, Christina had somewhat fallen from her original perfection as regards money. She had got gradually in arrear during many successive quarters, till she had contracted a chronic loan, a sort of domestic national debt, amounting to between £7 and £8. Theobald at length felt that a remonstrance had become imperative, and took advantage of his silver wedding day to inform Christina that her indebtedness was cancelled, and at the same time to beg that she would endeavour henceforth to equalize her expenditure and her income. She burst into tears of love and gratitude, assured him that he was the best and most generous of men, and never during the remainder of her married life was she a single shilling behindhand. Christina hated change of all sorts no less cordially than her husband. She and Theobald had nearly everything in this world that they could wish for. Why, then, should people desire to introduce all sorts of changes of which no one could foresee the end? Religion, she was deeply convinced, had long since attained its final development, nor could it enter into the heart of reasonable man to conceive any faith more perfect than was inculcated by the Church of England. She could imagine no position more honourable than that of a clergyman's wife, unless indeed it were a bishop's. Considering his father's influence, it was not at all impossible that Theobald might be a bishop some day, and then would occur to her that one little flaw in the practice of the Church of England, a flaw not indeed in its doctrine, but in its policy, which she believed on the whole to be a mistaken one in this respect. I mean the fact that a bishop's wife does not take the rank of her husband. This had been the doing of Elizabeth, who had been a bad woman, of exceeding doubtful moral character, and at heart a papist to the last. Perhaps people ought to have been above mere considerations of worldly dignity, but the world was as it was, and such things carried weight with them, whether they ought to do so or no. Her influence as plain Mrs. Pontifex, wife, we will say, of the Bishop of Winchester, would no doubt be considerable. Such a character as hers could not fail to carry weight if she were ever in a sufficiently conspicuous sphere for its influence to be widely felt, but as Lady Winchester, or the Bishopess, which would sound quite nicely, who could doubt that her power for good would be enhanced? And it would be all the nicer because if she had a daughter, the daughter would not be a bishopess unless indeed she were to marry a bishop too, which would not be likely. These were her thoughts upon her good days. At other times she would, to do her justice, have doubts whether she was in all respects as spiritually minded as she ought to be. She must press on, till every enemy to her salvation was surmounted and Satan himself lay bruised under her feet. It occurred to her on one of these occasions that she might steal a march over some of her contemporaries if she were to leave off eating black puddings, of which whenever they had killed a pig she had hitherto partaken freely, and if she were also careful that no fowls were served at her table which had had their necks wrung, but only such as had had their throats cut and been allowed to bleed. St. Paul and the Church of Jerusalem had insisted upon it as necessary that even Gentile converts should abstain from things strangled and from blood, and they had joined this prohibition with that of a vice about the abominable nature of which there could be no question. It would be well therefore to abstain in future and see whether any noteworthy spiritual result ensued. She did abstain, and was certain that from the day of her resolve she had felt stronger, purer in heart, and in all respects more spiritually minded than she had ever felt hitherto. Theobald did not lay so much stress on this as she did, but as she settled what he should have at dinner she could take care that he got no strangled fowls. As for black puddings, happily, he had seen them made when he was a boy, and had never got over his aversion for them. She wished the matter were one of more general observance than it was. This was just a case in which as Lady Winchester she might have been able to do what as plain Mrs. Pontifex it was hopeless even to attempt. And thus this worthy couple jogged on from month to month and from year to year. The reader, if he has passed middle life and has a clerical connection, will probably remember scores and scores of rectors and rectors' wives who differed in no material respect from Theobald and Christina. Speaking from a recollection and experience extending over nearly 80 years from the time when I was myself a child in the nursery of a vicarage, I should say I had drawn the better rather than the worse side of the life of an English country parson of some 50 years ago. I admit, however, that there are no such people to be found nowadays. A more united or, on the whole, happier couple could not have been found in England. One grief only overshadowed the early years of their married life, I mean the fact that no living children were born to them. Chapter 17. In the course of time this sorrow was removed. At the beginning of the 5th year of her married life Christina was safely delivered of a boy. This was on the 6th of September 1835. Word was immediately sent to old Mr. Pontifex, who received the news with real pleasure. His son John's wife had borne daughters only, and he was seriously uneasy lest there should be a failure in the male line of his descendants. The good news, therefore, was doubly welcome, and caused as much delight at Elmhurst as dismay in Woburn Square, where the John Pontifexes were then living. Here, indeed, this freak of fortune was felt to be all the more cruel on account of the impossibility of resenting it openly, but the delighted grandfather cared nothing for what the John Pontifexes might feel or not feel. He had wanted a grandson and he had got a grandson, and this should be enough for everybody, and, now that Mrs. Theobald had taken to good ways, she might bring him more grandsons, which would be desirable, for he should not feel safe with fewer than 3. He rang the bell for the butler. "Gelstrap," he said solemnly, "I want to go down into the cellar." Then Gelstrap preceded him with a candle, and he went into the inner vault where he kept his choicest wines. He passed many bins. There was 1803 port, 1792 imperial Tokay, 1800 claret, 1812 sherry. These and many others were passed, but it was not for them that the head of the Pontifex family had gone down into his inner cellar. A bin, which had appeared empty until the full light of the candle had been brought to bear upon it, was now found to contain a single pint bottle. This was the object of Mr. Pontifex's search. Gelstrap had often pondered over this bottle. It had been placed there by Mr. Pontifex himself about a dozen years previously, on his return from a visit to his friend the celebrated traveller Dr. Jones, but there was no tablet above the bin which might give a clue to the nature of its contents. On more than one occasion when his master had gone out and left his keys accidentally behind him, as he sometimes did, Gelstrap had submitted the bottle to all the tests he could venture upon, but it was so carefully sealed that wisdom remained quite shut out from that entrance at which he would have welcomed her most gladly, and indeed from all other entrances, for he could make out nothing at all. And now the mystery was to be solved. But alas! It seemed as though the last chance of securing even a sip of the contents was to be removed forever, for Mr. Pontifex took the bottle into his own hands and held it up to the light after carefully examining the seal. He smiled and left the bin with the bottle in his hands. Then came a catastrophe. He stumbled over an empty hamper. There was the sound of a fall, a smash of broken glass, and in an instant the cellar floor was covered with the liquid that had been preserved so carefully for so many years. With his usual presence of mind Mr. Pontifex gasped out a month's warning to Gelstrap. Then he got up, and stamped as Theobald had done when Christina had wanted not to order his dinner. "It's water from the Jordan," he exclaimed furiously, "which I have been saving for the baptism of my eldest grandson. Damn you, Gelstrap, how dare you be so infernally careless as to leave that hamper littering about the cellar? I wonder the water of the sacred stream did not stand upright as an heap upon the cellar floor and rebuke him." Gelstrap told the other servants afterwards that his master's language had made his backbone curdle. The moment, however, that he heard the word water, he saw his way again, and flew to the pantry. Before his master had well noted his absence he returned with a little sponge and a basin, and had begun sopping up the waters of the Jordan as though they had been a common slop. "I'll filter it, sir," said Gelstrap meekly. "It'll come quite clean." Mr. Pontifex saw hope in this suggestion, which was shortly carried out by the help of a piece of blotting paper and a funnel, under his own eyes. Eventually it was found that half a pint was saved, and this was held to be sufficient. Then he made preparations for a visit to Battersby. He ordered goodly hampers of the choicest eatables, he selected a goodly hamper of choice drinkables. I say choice and not choicest, for although in his first exaltation he had selected some of his very best wine, yet on reflection he had felt that there was moderation in all things, and as he was parting with his best water from the Jordan, he would only send some of his second best wine. Before he went to Battersby he stayed a day or two in London, which he now seldom did, being over 70 years old, and having practically retired from business. The John Pontifexes, who kept a sharp eye on him, discovered to their dismay that he had had an interview with his solicitors. Chapter 18. For the first time in his life Theobald felt that he had done something right, and could look forward to meeting his father without alarm. The old gentleman, indeed, had written him a most cordial letter, announcing his intention of standing godfather to the boy. Nay, I may as well give it in full, as it shows the writer at his best. It runs, "Dear Theobald, your letter gave me very sincere pleasure, the more so because I had made up my mind for the worst. Pray accept my most hearty congratulations for my daughter-in-law and for yourself. I have long preserved a phial of water from the Jordan for the christening of my first grandson, should it please God to grant me one. It was given me by my old friend Dr. Jones. You will agree with me that though the efficacy of the sacrament does not depend upon the source of the baptismal waters, yet, ceteris paribus, there is a sentiment attaching to the waters of the Jordan which should not be despised. Small matters like this sometimes influence a child's whole future career. I shall bring my own cook, and have told him to get everything ready for the christening dinner. Ask as many of your best neighbors as your table will hold. By the way, I have told Lesueur not to get a lobster. You had better drive over yourself and get one from Saltness, for Battersby was only 14 or 15 miles from the sea coast. They are better there, at least I think so, than anywhere else in England. I have put your boy down for something in the event of his attaining the age of 21 years. If your brother John continues to have nothing but girls I may do more later on, but I have many claims upon me, and am not as well off as you may imagine. Your affectionate father, G. Pontifex. A few days afterwards the writer of the above letter made his appearance in a fly which had brought him from Gildenham to Battersby, a distance of 14 miles. There was Lesueur, the cook, on the box with the driver, and as many hampers as the fly could carry were disposed upon the roof and elsewhere. Next day the John Pontifexes had to come, and Eliza and Maria, as well as Alethea, who, by her own special request, was godmother to the boy, for Mr. Pontifex had decided that they were to form a happy family party, so come they all must, and be happy they all must, or it would be the worse for them. Next day the author of all this hubbub was actually christened. Theobald had proposed to call him George after old Mr. Pontifex, but strange to say, Mr. Pontifex overruled him in favor of the name Ernest. The word Ernest was just beginning to come into fashion, and he thought the possession of such a name might, like his having been baptized in water from the Jordan, have a permanent effect upon the boy's character, and influence him for good during the more critical periods of his life. I was asked to be his second godfather, and was rejoiced to have an opportunity of meeting Alethea, whom I had not seen for some few years, but with whom I had been in constant correspondence. She and I had always been friends from the time we had played together as children onwards. When the death of her grandfather and grandmother severed her connection with Pelham, my intimacy with the Pontifexes was kept up by my having been at school and college with Theobald, and each time I saw her I admired her more and more as the best, kindest, wittiest, most lovable, and, to my mind, handsomest woman whom I had ever seen. None of the Pontifexes were deficient in good looks, they were a well-grown shapely family enough, but Alethea was the flower of the flock even as regards good looks, while in respect of all other qualities that make a woman lovable, it seemed as though the stock that had been intended for the 3 daughters, and would have been about sufficient for them, had all been allotted to herself, her sisters getting none, and she all. It is impossible for me to explain how it was that she and I never married. We two knew exceedingly well, and that must suffice for the reader. There was the most perfect sympathy and understanding between us. We knew that neither of us would marry anyone else. I had asked her to marry me a dozen times over. Having said this much, I will say no more upon a point which is in no way necessary for the development of my story. For the last few years there had been difficulties in the way of our meeting, and I had not seen her, though, as I have said, keeping up a close correspondence with her. Naturally I was overjoyed to meet her again. She was now just 30 years old, but I thought she looked handsomer than ever. Her father, of course, was the lion of the party, but seeing that we were all meek and quite willing to be eaten, he roared to us rather than at us. It was a fine sight to see him tucking his napkin under his rosy old gills, and letting it fall over his capacious waistcoat while the high light from the chandelier danced about the bump of benevolence on his bald old head like a star of Bethlehem. The soup was real turtle, the old gentleman was evidently well pleased, and he was beginning to come out. Gelstrap stood behind his master's chair. I sat next Mrs. Theobald on her left hand, and was thus just opposite her father-in-law, whom I had every opportunity of observing. During the first 10 minutes or so, which were taken up with the soup and the bringing in of the fish, I should probably have thought, if I had not long since made up my mind about him, what a fine old man he was and how proud his children should be of him, but suddenly as he was helping himself to lobster sauce, he flushed crimson, a look of extreme vexation suffused his face, and he darted 2 furtive but fiery glances to the 2 ends of the table, one for Theobald and one for Christina. They, poor simple souls, of course saw that something was exceedingly wrong, and so did I, but I couldn't guess what it was till I heard the old man hiss in Christina's ear, "It was not made with a hen lobster." "What's the use," he continued, "of my calling the boy Ernest, and getting him christened in water from the Jordan, if his own father does not know a cock from a hen lobster?" This cut me too, for I felt that till that moment I had not so much as known that there were cocks and hens among lobsters, but had vaguely thought that in the matter of matrimony they were even as the angels in heaven, and grew up almost spontaneously from rocks and seaweed. Before the next course was over Mr. Pontifex had recovered his temper, and from that time to the end of the evening he was at his best. He told us all about the water from the Jordan, how it had been brought by Dr. Jones along with some stone jars of water from the Rhine, the Rhone, the Elbe and the Danube, and what trouble he had had with them at the custom houses, and how the intention had been to make punch with waters from all the greatest rivers in Europe, and how he, Mr. Pontifex, had saved the Jordan water from going into the bowl, etc., etc. "No, no, no," he continued, "it wouldn't have done at all, you know, very profane idea, so we each took a pint bottle of it home with us, and the punch was much better without it. I had a narrow escape with mine, though, the other day, I fell over a hamper in the cellar, when I was getting it up to bring to Battersby, and if I had not taken the greatest care the bottle would certainly have been broken, but I saved it." And Gelstrap was standing behind his chair all the time. Nothing more happened to ruffle Mr. Pontifex, so we had a delightful evening, which has often recurred to me while watching the after-career of my godson. I called a day or 2 afterwards and found Mr. Pontifex still at Battersby, laid up with one of those attacks of liver and depression to which he was becoming more and more subject. I stayed to luncheon. The old gentleman was cross and very difficult, he could eat nothing, had no appetite at all. Christina tried to coax him with a little bit of the fleshy part of a mutton chop. "How in the name of reason can I be asked to eat a mutton chop?" he exclaimed angrily. "You forget, my dear Christina, that you have to deal with a stomach that is totally disorganized," and he pushed the plate from him, pouting and frowning like a naughty old child. Writing as I do by the light of a later knowledge, I suppose I should have seen nothing in this but the world's growing pains, the disturbance inseparable from transition in human things. I suppose in reality not a leaf goes yellow in autumn without ceasing to care about its sap and making the parent tree very uncomfortable by long growling and grumbling, but surely nature might find some less irritating way of carrying on business if she would give her mind to it. Why should the generations overlap one another at all? Why cannot we be buried as eggs in neat little cells with 10 or 20,000 pounds each wrapped round us in Bank of England notes, and wake up, as this fex wasp does, to find that its papa and mamma have not only left ample provision at its elbow, but have been eaten by sparrows some weeks before it began to live consciously on its own account. About a year and a half afterwards the tables were turned on Battersby, for Mrs. John Pontifex was safely delivered of a boy. A year or so later still, George Pontifex was himself struck down suddenly by a fit of paralysis, much as his mother had been, but he did not see the years of his mother. When his will was opened, it was found that an original bequest of £20,000 to Theobald himself, over and above the sum that had been settled upon him and Christina at the time of his marriage, had been cut down to £17,500 when Mr. Pontifex left something to Ernest. The something proved to be £2,500, which was to accumulate in the hands of trustees. The rest of the property went to John Pontifex, except that each of the daughters was left with about £15,000 over and above £5,000 apiece which they inherited from their mother. Theobald's father then had told him the truth but not the whole truth. Nevertheless, what right had Theobald to complain? Certainly it was rather hard to make him think that he and his were to be gainers, and get the honor and glory of the bequest, when all the time the money was virtually being taken out of Theobald's own pocket. On the other hand, the father doubtless argued that he had never told Theobald he was to have anything at all. He had a full right to do what he liked with his own money. If Theobald chose to indulge in unwarrantable expectations, that was no affair of his, as it was he was providing for him liberally, and if he did take £2,500 of Theobald's share he was still leaving it to Theobald's son, which, of course, was much the same thing in the end. No one can deny that the testator had strict right upon his side. Nevertheless, the reader will agree with me that Theobald and Christina might not have considered the christening dinner so great a success if all the facts had been before them. Mr. Pontifex had during his own lifetime set up a monument in Elmhurst Church to the memory of his wife, a slab with urns and cherubs like illegitimate children of King George IV, and all the rest of it, and had left space for his own epitaph underneath that of his wife. I do not know whether it was written by one of his children, or whether they got some friend to write it for them. I do not believe that any satire was intended. I believe that it was the intention to convey that nothing short of the Day of Judgment could give anyone an idea how good a man Mr. Pontifex had been, but at first I found it hard to think that it was free from guile. The epitaph begins by giving dates of birth and death, then sets out that the deceased was for many years head of the firm of Fairley and Pontifex, and also resident in the parish of Elmhurst. There is not a syllable of either praise or dispraise. The last lines run as follows: he now lies awaiting a joyful resurrection at the last day. What manner of man he was that day will discover. Chapter 19. This much, however, we may say in the meantime, that having lived to be nearly 73 years old and died rich, he must have been in very fair harmony with his surroundings. I have heard it said sometimes that such and such a person's life was a lie, but no man's life can be a very bad lie. As long as it continues at all, it is at worst 9/10 of it true. Mr. Pontifex's life not only continued a long time, but was prosperous right up to the end. Is not this enough? Being in this world, is it not our most obvious business to make the most of it, to observe what things do bona fide tend to long life and comfort, and to act accordingly? All animals, except man, know that the principal business of life is to enjoy it, and they do enjoy it as much as man and other circumstances will allow. He has spent his life best who has enjoyed it most. God will take care that we do not enjoy it any more than is good for us. If Mr. Pontifex is to be blamed, it is for not having eaten and drunk less and thus suffered less from his liver, and lived perhaps a year or two longer. Goodness is not unless it tends towards old age and sufficiency of means. I speak broadly and acceptus excipientes. So the psalmist says, "The righteous shall not lack anything that is good." Either this is mere poetical license, or it follows that he who lacks anything that is good is not righteous. There is a presumption also that he who has passed a long life without lacking anything that is good has himself also been good enough for practical purposes. Mr. Pontifex never lacked anything he much cared about. True, he might have been happier than he was if he had cared about things which he did not care for, but the gist of this lies in the "if he had cared." We have all sinned and come short of the glory of making ourselves as comfortable as we easily might have done, but in this particular case Mr. Pontifex did not care, and would not have gained much by getting what he did not want. There is no casting of swine's meat before men worse than that which would flatter virtue as though her true origin were not good enough for her, but she must have a lineage, deduced as it were by spiritual heralds, from some stock with which she has nothing to do. Virtue's true lineage is older and more respectable than any that can be invented for her. She springs from man's experience concerning his own well-being, and this, though not infallible, is still the least fallible thing we have. A system which cannot stand without a better foundation than this must have something so unstable within itself that it will topple over on whatever pedestal we place it. The world has long ago settled that morality and virtue are what bring men peace at the last. Be virtuous, says the copybook, and you will be happy. Surely if a reputed virtue fails often in this respect, it is only an insidious form of vice, and if a reputed vice brings no very serious mischief on a man's later years, it is not so bad a vice as it is said to be. Unfortunately, though we are all of a mind about the main opinion that virtue is what tends to happiness, and vice what ends in sorrow, we are not so unanimous about details, that is to say as to whether any given course, such, we will say, as smoking, has a tendency to happiness or the reverse. I submit it as the result of my own poor observation, that a good deal of unkindness and selfishness on the part of parents towards children is not generally followed by ill consequences to the parents themselves. They may cast a gloom over their children's lives for many years without having to suffer anything that will hurt them. I should say, then, that it shows no great moral obliquity on the part of parents if within certain limits they make their children's lives a burden to them. Granted that Mr. Pontifex's was not a very exalted character, ordinary men are not required to have very exalted characters. It is enough if we are of the same moral and mental stature as the main or mean part of men, that is to say as the average. It is involved in the very essence of things that rich men who die old shall have been mean. The greatest and wisest of mankind will be almost always found to be the meanest, the ones who have kept the mean best between excess either of virtue or vice. They hardly ever have been prosperous if they have not done this, and, considering how many miscarry altogether, it is no small feather in a man's cap if he has been no worse than his neighbors. Homer tells us about someone who made it his business, Greek text, always to excel and to stand higher than other people. What an uncompanionable, disagreeable person he must have been. Homer's heroes generally came to a bad end, and I doubt not that this gentleman, whoever he was, did so sooner or later. A very high standard, again, involves the possession of rare virtues, and rare virtues are like rare plants or animals, things that have not been able to hold their own in the world. A virtue to be serviceable must, like gold, be alloyed with some commoner but more durable metal. People divide off vice and virtue as though they were two things, neither of which had with it anything of the other. This is not so. There is no useful virtue which has not some alloy of vice, and hardly any vice, if any, which carries not with it a little dash of virtue. Virtue and vice are like life and death, or mind and matter, things which cannot exist without being qualified by their opposite. The most absolute life contains death, and the corpse is still in many respects living, so also it has been said, if thou, Lord, wilt be extreme to mark what is done amiss, which shows that even the highest ideal we can conceive will yet admit so much compromise with vice as shall countenance the poor abuses of the time, if they are not too outrageous. That vice pays homage to virtue is notorious, we call this hypocrisy. There should be a word found for the homage which virtue not unfrequently pays, or at any rate would be wise in paying, to vice. I grant that some men will find happiness in having what we all feel to be a higher moral standard than others. If they go in for this, however, they must be content with virtue as her own reward, and not grumble if they find lofty quixotism an expensive luxury, whose rewards belong to a kingdom that is not of this world. They must not wonder if they cut a poor figure in trying to make the most of both worlds. Disbelieve as we may the details of the accounts which record the growth of the Christian religion, yet a great part of Christian teaching will remain as true as though we accepted the details. We cannot serve God and mammon. Straight is the way and narrow is the gate which leads to what those who live by faith hold to be best worth having, and there is no way of saying this better than the Bible has done. It is well there should be some who think thus, as it is well there should be speculators in commerce, who will often burn their fingers, but it is not well that the majority should leave the mean and beaten path. For most men, and most circumstances, pleasure, tangible material prosperity in this world, is the safest test of virtue. Progress has ever been through the pleasures rather than through the extreme sharp virtues, and the most virtuous have leaned to excess rather than to asceticism. To use a commercial metaphor, competition is so keen, and the margin of profits has been cut down so closely that virtue cannot afford to throw any bona fide chance away, and must base her action rather on the actual moneying out of conduct than on a flattering prospectus. She will not therefore neglect, as some do who are prudent and economical enough in other matters, the important factor of our chance of escaping detection, or at any rate of our dying first. A reasonable virtue will give this chance its due value, neither more nor less. Pleasure, after all, is a safer guide than either right or duty. For hard as it is to know what gives us pleasure, right and duty are often still harder to distinguish and, if we go wrong with them, will lead us into just as sorry a plight as a mistaken opinion concerning pleasure. When men burn their fingers through following after pleasure, they find out their mistake and get to see where they have gone wrong more easily than when they have burnt them through following after a fancied duty, or a fancied idea concerning right virtue. The devil, in fact, when he dresses himself in angel's clothes, can only be detected by experts of exceptional skill, and so often does he adopt this disguise that it is hardly safe to be seen talking to an angel at all, and prudent people will follow after pleasure as a more homely but more respectable and on the whole much more trustworthy guide. Returning to Mr. Pontifex, over and above his having lived long and prosperously, he left numerous offspring, to all of whom he communicated not only his physical and mental characteristics, with no more than the usual amount of modification, but also no small share of characteristics which are less easily transmitted, I mean his pecuniary characteristics. It may be said that he acquired these by sitting still and letting money run, as it were, right up against him, but against how many does not money run who do not take it when it does, or who, even if they hold it for a little while, cannot so incorporate it with themselves that it shall descend through them to their offspring. Mr. Pontifex did this. He kept what he may be said to have made, and money is like a reputation for ability, more easily made than kept. Take him, then, for all in all, I am not inclined to be so severe upon him as my father was. Judge him according to any very lofty standard, and he is nowhere. Judge him according to a fair average standard, and there is not much fault to be found with him. I have said what I have said in the foregoing chapter once for all, and shall not break my thread to repeat it. It should go without saying in modification of the verdict which the reader may be inclined to pass too hastily, not only upon Mr. George Pontifex, but also upon Theobald and Christina. And now I will continue my story. Chapter 20. The birth of his son opened Theobald's eyes to a good deal which he had but faintly realized hitherto. He had had no idea how great a nuisance a baby was. Babies come into the world so suddenly at the end, and upset everything so terribly when they do come. Why cannot they steal in upon us with less of a shock to the domestic system? His wife, too, did not recover rapidly from her confinement. She remained an invalid for months. Here was another nuisance, and an expensive one, which interfered with the amount which Theobald liked to put by out of his income against, as he said, a rainy day, or to make provision for his family if he should have one. Now he was getting a family, so that it became all the more necessary to put money by, and here was the baby hindering him. Theorists may say what they like about a man's children being a continuation of his own identity, but it will generally be found that those who talk in this way have no children of their own. Practical family men know better. About 12 months after the birth of Ernest there came a second, also a boy, who was christened Joseph, and in less than 12 months afterwards, a girl, to whom was given the name of Charlotte. A few months before this girl was born, Christina paid a visit to the John Pontifexes in London, and, knowing her condition, passed a good deal of time at the Royal Academy exhibition looking at the types of female beauty portrayed by the academicians, for she had made up her mind that the child this time was to be a girl. Alethea warned her not to do this, but she persisted, and certainly the child turned out plain, but whether the pictures caused this or no I cannot say. Theobald had never liked children. He had always got away from them as soon as he could, and so had they from him. Oh, why, he was inclined to ask himself, could not children be born into the world grown up? If Christina could have given birth to a few full-grown clergymen in priests' orders, of moderate views, but inclining rather to evangelicalism, with comfortable livings and in all respects facsimiles of Theobald himself, why, there might have been more sense in it. Or if people could buy ready-made children at a shop of whatever age and sex they liked, instead of always having to make them at home and to begin at the beginning with them, that might do better, but as it was he did not like it. He felt as he had felt when he had been required to come and be married to Christina, that he had been going on for a long time quite nicely, and would much rather continue things on their present footing. In the matter of getting married he had been obliged to pretend he liked it. But times were changed, and if he did not like a thing now, he could find 100 unexceptionable ways of making his dislike apparent. It might have been better if Theobald in his younger days had kicked more against his father. The fact that he had not done so encouraged him to expect the most implicit obedience from his own children. He could trust himself, he said, and so did Christina, to be more lenient than perhaps his father had been to himself. His danger, he said, and so again did Christina, would be rather in the direction of being too indulgent. He must be on his guard against this, for no duty could be more important than that of teaching a child to obey its parents in all things. He had read not long since of an Eastern traveler, who, while exploring somewhere in the more remote parts of Arabia and Asia Minor, had come upon a remarkably hardy, sober, industrious little Christian community, all of them in the best of health, who had turned out to be the actual living descendants of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, and 2 men in European costume, indeed, but speaking English with a broken accent, and by their color evidently Oriental, had come begging to Battersby soon afterwards, and represented themselves as belonging to this people. They had said they were collecting funds to promote the conversion of their fellow tribesmen to the English branch of the Christian religion. True, they turned out to be impostors, for when he gave them £1 and Christina 5 shillings from her private purse, they went and got drunk with it in the next village but one to Battersby. Still, this did not invalidate the story of the Eastern traveler. Then there were the Romans, whose greatness was probably due to the wholesome authority exercised by the head of a family over all its members. Some Romans had even killed their children. This was going too far, but then the Romans were not Christians, and knew no better. The practical outcome of the foregoing was a conviction in Theobald's mind, and if in his, then in Christina's, that it was their duty to begin training up their children in the way they should go, even from their earliest infancy. The first signs of self-will must be carefully looked for, and plucked up by the roots at once before they had time to grow. Theobald picked up this numb serpent of a metaphor and cherished it in his bosom. Before Ernest could well crawl he was taught to kneel, before he could well speak he was taught to lisp the Lord's Prayer, and the general confession. How was it possible that these things could be taught too early? If his attention flagged or his memory failed him, here was an ill weed which would grow apace, unless it were plucked out immediately, and the only way to pluck it out was to whip him, or shut him up in a cupboard, or dock him of some of the small pleasures of childhood. Before he was 3 years old he could read and, after a fashion, write. Before he was 4 he was learning Latin, and could do rule of 3 sums. As for the child himself, he was naturally of an even temper. He doted upon his nurse, on kittens and puppies, and on all things that would do him the kindness of allowing him to be fond of them. He was fond of his mother, too, but as regards his father, he has told me in later life he could remember no feeling but fear and shrinking. Christina did not remonstrate with Theobald concerning the severity of the tasks imposed upon their boy, nor yet as to the continual whippings that were found necessary at lesson times. Indeed, when during any absence of Theobald's the lessons were entrusted to her, she found to her sorrow that it was the only thing to do, and she did it no less effectually than Theobald himself. Nevertheless she was fond of her boy, which Theobald never was, and it was long before she could destroy all affection for herself in the mind of her firstborn. But she persevered. Chapter 21. Strange. For she believed she doted upon him, and certainly she loved him better than either of her other children. Her version of the matter was that there had never yet been 2 parents so self-denying and devoted to the highest welfare of their children as Theobald and herself. For Ernest, a very great future, she was certain of it, was in store. This made severity all the more necessary, so that from the first he might have been kept pure from every taint of evil. She could not allow herself the scope for castle building which, we read, was indulged in by every Jewish matron before the appearance of the Messiah, for the Messiah had now come, but there was to be a millennium shortly, certainly not later than 1866, when Ernest would be just about the right age for it, and a modern Elias would be wanted to herald its approach. Heaven would bear her witness that she had never shrunk from the idea of martyrdom for herself and Theobald, nor would she avoid it for her boy, if his life was required of her in her Redeemer's service. Oh, no. If God told her to offer up her firstborn, as he had told Abraham, she would take him up to Pigberry Beacon and plunge that she could not do, but it would be unnecessary, someone else might do that. It was not for nothing that Ernest had been baptized in water from the Jordan. It had not been her doing, nor yet Theobald's. They had not sought it. When water from the sacred stream was wanted for a sacred infant, the channel had been found through which it was to flow from far Palestine over land and sea to the door of the house where the child was lying. Why, it was a miracle. It was. It was. She saw it all now. The Jordan had left its bed and flowed into her own house. It was idle to say that this was not a miracle. No miracle was effected without means of some kind. The difference between the faithful and the unbeliever consisted in the very fact that the former could see a miracle where the latter could not. The Jews could see no miracle even in the raising of Lazarus and the feeding of the 5,000. The John Pontifexes would see no miracle in this matter of the water from the Jordan. The essence of a miracle lay not in the fact that means had been dispensed with, but in the adoption of means to a great end that had not been available without interference, and no one would suppose that Dr. Jones would have brought the water unless he had been directed. She would tell this to Theobald, and get him to see it in and yet perhaps it would be better not. The insight of women upon matters of this sort was deeper and more unerring than that of men. It was a woman and not a man who had been filled most completely with the whole fullness of the deity. But why had they not treasured up the water after it was used? It ought never, never to have been thrown away, but it had been. Perhaps, however, this was for the best too. They might have been tempted to set too much store by it, and it might have become a source of spiritual danger to them, perhaps even of spiritual pride, the very sin of all others which she most abhorred. As for the channel through which the Jordan had flowed to Battersby, that mattered not more than the earth through which the river ran in Palestine itself. Dr. Jones was certainly worldly, very worldly, so, she regretted to feel, had been her father-in-law, though in a less degree, spiritual, at heart, doubtless, and becoming more and more spiritual continually as he grew older. Still he was tainted with the world, till a very few hours, probably, before his death, whereas she and Theobald had given up all for Christ's sake. They were not worldly. At least Theobald was not. She had been, but she was sure she had grown in grace since she had left off eating things strangled and blood. This was as the washing in Jordan as against Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus. Her boy should never touch a strangled fowl nor a black pudding, that, at any rate, she could see to. He should have a coral from the neighborhood of Joppa. There were coral insects on those coasts, so that the thing could easily be done with a little energy. She would write to Dr. Jones about it, etc., and so on for hours together, day after day for years. Truly, Mrs. Theobald loved her child according to her lights with an exceeding great fondness, but the dreams she had dreamed in sleep were sober realities in comparison with those she indulged in while awake. When Ernest was in his 2nd year, Theobald, as I have already said, began to teach him to read. He began to whip him 2 days after he had begun to teach him. It was painful, as he said to Christina, but it was the only thing to do, and it was done. The child was puny, white and sickly, so they sent continually for the doctor, who dosed him with calomel and James's powder. All was done in love, anxiety, timidity, stupidity, and impatience. They were stupid in little things, and he that is stupid in little will be stupid also in much. Presently old Mr. Pontifex died, and then came the revelation of the little alteration he had made in his will simultaneously with his bequest to Ernest. It was rather hard to bear, especially as there was no way of conveying a bit of their minds to the testator now that he could no longer hurt them. As regards the boy himself, anyone must see that the bequest would be an unmitigated misfortune to him. To leave him a small independence was perhaps the greatest injury which one could inflict upon a young man. It would cripple his energies, and deaden his desire for active employment. Many a youth was led into evil courses by the knowledge that on arriving at majority he would come into a few thousands. They might surely have been trusted to have their boy's interests at heart, and must be better judges of those interests than he, at 21, could be expected to be. Besides, if Jonadab, the son of Rechab's father, or perhaps it might be simpler under the circumstances to say Rechab at once, if Rechab, then, had left handsome legacies to his grandchildren, why Jonadab might not have found those children so easy to deal with, etc. My dear, said Theobald, after having discussed the matter with Christina for the 20th time, my dear, the only thing to guide and console us under misfortunes of this kind is to take refuge in practical work. I will go and pay a visit to Mrs. Thompson. On those days Mrs. Thompson would be told that her sins were all washed white, etc., a little sooner and a little more peremptorily than on others. Chapter 22. I used to stay at Battersby for a day or two sometimes, while my godson and his brother and sister were children. I hardly know why I went, for Theobald and I grew more and more apart, but one gets into grooves sometimes, and the supposed friendship between myself and the Pontifexes continued to exist, though it was now little more than rudimentary. My godson pleased me more than either of the other children, but he had not much of the buoyancy of childhood, and was more like a puny, sallow little old man than I liked. The young people, however, were very ready to be friendly. I remember Ernest and his brother hovered round me on the first day of one of these visits with their hands full of fading flowers, which they at length proffered me. On this I did what I suppose was expected. I inquired if there was a shop near where they could buy sweeties. They said there was, so I felt in my pockets, but only succeeded in finding 2 pence halfpenny in small money. This I gave them, and the youngsters, aged 4 and 3, dawdled off alone. Ere long they returned, and Ernest said, "We can't get sweeties for all this money." I felt rebuked, but no rebuke was intended. "We can get sweeties for this," showing a penny, "and for this," showing another penny, "but we cannot get them for all this," and he added the halfpenny to the 2 pence. I suppose they had wanted a twopenny cake, or something like that. I was amused, and left them to solve the difficulty their own way, being anxious to see what they would do. Presently Ernest said, "May we give you back this," showing the halfpenny, "and not give you back this and this?" showing the pence. I assented, and they gave a sigh of relief and went on their way rejoicing. A few more presents of pence and small toys completed the conquest, and they began to take me into their confidence. They told me a good deal which I am afraid I ought not to have listened to. They said that if Grandpapa had lived longer he would most likely have been made a lord, and that then Papa would have been the honorable and reverend, but that Grandpapa was now in heaven singing beautiful hymns with Grandmama Elby to Jesus Christ, who was very fond of them, and that when Ernest was ill, his mamma had told him he need not be afraid of dying for he would go straight to heaven, if he would only be sorry for having done his lessons so badly and vexed his dear papa, and if he would promise never, never to vex him any more, and that when he got to heaven Grandpapa and Grandmama Elby would meet him, and he would be always with them, and they would be very good to him and teach him to sing ever such beautiful hymns, more beautiful by far than those which he was now so fond of, etc., etc., but he did not wish to die, and was glad when he got better, for there were no kittens in heaven, and he did not think there were cowslips to make cowslip tea with. Their mother was plainly disappointed in them. "My children are none of them geniuses, Mr. Overton," she said to me at breakfast one morning. "They have fair abilities, and, thanks to Theobald's tuition, they are forward for their years, but they have nothing like genius. Genius is a thing apart from this, is it not?" Of course I said it was a thing quite apart from this, but if my thoughts had been laid bare, they would have appeared as "Give me my coffee immediately, ma'am, and don't talk nonsense." I have no idea what genius is, but so far as I can form any conception about it, I should say it was a stupid word which cannot be too soon abandoned to scientific and literary claqueurs. I do not know exactly what Christina expected, but I should imagine it was something like this: "My children ought to be all geniuses, because they are mine and Theobald's, and it is naughty of them not to be, but, of course, they cannot be so good and clever as Theobald and I were, and if they show signs of being so it will be naughty of them." Happily, however, they are not this, and yet it is very dreadful that they are not. As for genius, hoity-toity, indeed, why, a genius should turn intellectual somersaults as soon as it is born, and none of my children have yet been able to get into the newspapers. I will not have children of mine give themselves airs, it is enough for them that Theobald and I should do so. She did not know, poor woman, that the true greatness wears an invisible cloak, under cover of which it goes in and out among men without being suspected. If its cloak does not conceal it from itself always, and from all others for many years, its greatness will ere long shrink to very ordinary dimensions. What, then, it may be asked, is the good of being great? The answer is that you may understand greatness better in others, whether alive or dead, and choose better company from these and enjoy and understand that company better when you have chosen it, also that you may be able to give pleasure to the best people and live in the lives of those who are yet unborn. This, one would think, was substantial gain enough for greatness without its wanting to ride roughshod over us, even when disguised as humility. I was there on a Sunday, and observed the rigor with which the young people were taught to observe the Sabbath. They might not cut out things, nor use their paint-box on a Sunday, and this they thought rather hard, because their cousins the John Pontifexes might do these things. Their cousins might play with their toy train on Sunday, but though they had promised that they would run none but Sunday trains, all traffic had been prohibited. One treat only was allowed them: on Sunday evenings they might choose their own hymns. In the course of the evening they came into the drawing-room, and, as an especial treat, were to sing some of their hymns to me, instead of saying them, so that I might hear how nicely they sang. Ernest was to choose the first hymn, and he chose one about some people who were to come to the sunset tree. I am no botanist, and do not know what kind of tree a sunset tree is, but the words began, "Come, come, come, came to the sunset tree for the day is past and gone." The tune was rather pretty and had taken Ernest's fancy, for he was unusually fond of music and had a sweet little child's voice which he liked using. He was, however, very late in being able to sound a hard at C or K, and, instead of saying come, he said tum tum, tum. "Ernest," said Theobald, from the armchair in front of the fire, where he was sitting with his hands folded before him, "don't you think it would be very nice if you were to say come like other people, instead of tum?" "I do say tum," replied Ernest, meaning that he had said come. Theobald was always in a bad temper on Sunday evening. Whether it is that they are as much bored with the day as their neighbors, or whether they are tired, or whatever the cause may be, clergymen are seldom at their best on Sunday evening. I had already seen signs that evening that my host was cross, and was a little nervous at hearing Ernest say so promptly "I do say tum," when his papa had said he did not say it as he should. Theobald noticed the fact that he was being contradicted in a moment. He got up from his armchair and went to the piano. "No, Ernest, you don't," he said, "you say nothing of the kind, you say tum, not come. Now say come after me, as I do." "Tum," said Ernest, at once, "is that better?" I have no doubt he thought it was, but it was not. "Now, Ernest, you are not taking pains, you are not trying as you ought to do. It is high time you learn to say come." "Why, Joey can say come, can't you, Joey?" "Yeth, I can," replied Joey, and he said something which was not far off come. "There, Ernest, do you hear that? There's no difficulty about it, nor shadow of difficulty. Now, take your own time, think about it, and say come after me." The boy remained silent a few seconds and then said tum again. I laughed, but Theobald turned to me impatiently and said, "Please do not laugh, Overton, it will make the boy think it does not matter, and it matters a great deal." Then turning to Ernest he said, "Now, Ernest, I will give you one more chance, and if you don't say come, I shall know that you are self-willed and naughty." He looked very angry, and a shade came over Ernest's face, like that which comes upon the face of a puppy when it is being scolded without understanding why. The child saw well what was coming now, was frightened, and, of course, said tum once more. "Very well, Ernest," said his father, catching him angrily by the shoulder. "I have done my best to save you, but if you will have it so, you will," and he lugged the little wretch, crying by anticipation, out of the room. A few minutes more and we could hear screams coming from the dining room, across the hall which separated the drawing room from the dining room, and knew that poor Ernest was being beaten. "I have sent him up to bed," said Theobald, as he returned to the drawing room, "and now, Christina, I think we will have the servants in to prayers," and he rang the bell for them, red-handed as he was.